The security guards approached her desk with the confidence of men who had done this before. Papers rustled. Whispers spread through the office like wildfire. Someone was finally being escorted out of the military base, and everyone assumed they knew who was in charge. They were about to learn how wrong assumptions can be. What started as a routine day at Peterson Air Force Base would end with phone calls to Washington, hastily written apologies, and a lesson that some people discovered the hard way: never judge authority by appearances. Because sometimes, the person you're trying to remove is the one who actually owns the keys to the entire operation. This is the true story of Colonel Sarah Martinez and the day that changed everything at one of America's most important military installations. Colonel Sarah Martinez arrived at Peterson Air Force Base at exactly 0630 hours, just as she had every morning for the past 18 months. The Colorado sunrise painted the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and pink, but Sarah barely noticed the view that tourists traveled thousands of miles to see. Her mind was already racing through the day ahead, filled with budget meetings, personnel reviews, and the endless paperwork that came with running one of the most critical military installations in the United States. At 38 years old, Sarah had earned her position through 2 decades of dedicated service, starting as a young lieutenant fresh out of the Air Force Academy. She had served tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, managed complex logistics operations across 3 continents, and earned the respect of everyone who worked with her. But, looking at her that morning, dressed in civilian clothes because of a medical appointment later in the day, she appeared to be just another contractor or administrative worker heading into the base. The trouble began when Sarah decided to grab coffee from the main administration building instead of her usual spot in the command center. The building housed various departments, including the contracting office, human resources, and several civilian support functions. It was also where the new security team had set up their temporary headquarters while their permanent office was being renovated. Staff Sergeant Mike Reynolds had been transferred to Peterson just 2 weeks earlier. A career military policeman with 15 years of experience, he prided himself on maintaining order and following regulations to the letter. Reynolds had spent the previous evening reviewing personnel files, trying to familiarize himself with the key players on base. However, he had only looked at official military photographs, where everyone wore their dress uniforms with rank clearly displayed. When Sarah walked into the administration building wearing dark slacks, a simple blue blouse, and carrying a briefcase that had seen better days, Reynolds saw what he believed to be a civilian contractor who had somehow bypassed the normal check-in procedures. He had been briefed about security concerns regarding unauthorized personnel, and this seemed like exactly the kind of situation his supervisor had warned him about. Sarah made her way to the coffee station, nodding politely to the few people she recognized. Most of the early morning crowd consisted of civilian employees and contractors who started their shifts before the main military personnel arrived. She poured herself a cup of the notoriously strong base coffee and checked her phone for any urgent messages from her staff. That was when Reynolds approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said in his most official tone. "I need to see your identification and visitor's badge." Sarah looked up from her phone, slightly confused. She had been coming to this building for over a year and had never been asked for identification by base personnel. Her ID badge was clipped to her briefcase, as was her normal practice when wearing civilian clothes. "Of course," she said, reaching for her badge. "Is there a problem?" Reynolds examined the ID card with the intensity of someone trying to spot a forgery. The name read S. Martinez, and the photo showed a woman in military dress uniform, but the rank insignia was small and somewhat unclear in the photograph. To Reynolds, who was still learning the names and faces of personnel at his new assignment, this could have been anyone from a junior enlisted member to a civilian contractor with base access. "This says you're military personnel," Reynolds said, his tone suggesting skepticism. "But you're not in uniform." "I have a medical appointment this morning," Sarah explained patiently. "I'm authorized to wear civilian clothes for medical visits. If you check the personnel roster, you'll see I'm listed as having approved civilian dress for today." But Reynolds had not yet learned how to access the daily personnel roster, and his training had emphasized the importance of not taking anyone's word at face value when it came to security matters. The fact that this woman seemed so calm and confident actually made him more suspicious. In his experience, people who were trying to get away with something often acted exactly this way. I'm going to need you to come with me to verify your status, Reynolds said, his hand moving unconsciously toward his radio. There seems to be some confusion about your authorization to be in this building. Sarah felt a flicker of irritation but kept her voice level. She understood that security was important, and she appreciated that this young sergeant was taking his job seriously. However, she also had a full schedule ahead of her, and this unnecessary delay was already making her late for her first meeting. Sergeant Reynolds, she said, reading his name tag, I understand you're new here, but I can assure you that my presence in this building is completely authorized. Perhaps you could call your supervisor if you have concerns? The use of his name surprised Reynolds, and he wondered how this civilian contractor knew who he was. This detail, rather than reassuring him, actually increased his suspicion. In his mind, someone who was trying to talk their way out of trouble might have done research on the security personnel. By this time, their conversation had begun to attract attention from other people in the coffee area. Several civilian employees had paused their morning routines to watch the interaction, and a few were whispering among themselves. Sarah noticed the growing audience and felt her irritation increase. She had always prided herself on maintaining her composure in difficult situations, but being treated like a potential security threat in front of base personnel was testing her patience. Ma'am, I'm going to have to insist that you come with me, Reynolds said, his voice becoming firmer. If everything is in order, we can have this resolved quickly. Sarah realized that the situation was escalating beyond a simple misunderstanding. She could see that Reynolds was committed to his course of action, and arguing with him in public would only make things worse. She also recognized that he was following proper security protocols, even if his assessment of the situation was completely wrong. Fine, she said, closing her briefcase with perhaps a bit more force than necessary. Let's get this resolved. As they walked toward the security office, Sarah's mind was racing through the implications of what was happening. She had dealt with bureaucratic confusion before, but never anything quite like this. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. Here she was, the person ultimately responsible for the security and operations of the entire base, being escorted like a potential threat by one of her own security personnel. Reynolds, for his part, was feeling more confident about his decision with each step. The woman's willingness to comply with his request seemed to confirm that there was indeed something irregular about her presence. In his experience, people who belonged somewhere rarely submitted to this kind of escort without more protest. They entered the security office, where Reynolds' supervisor, Master Sergeant Janet Coleman, was reviewing reports from the night shift. Coleman had been at Peterson for 3 years and knew most of the key personnel by sight, but she was facing away from the door when Reynolds and Sarah entered. Sergeant Coleman, Reynolds said, I've brought in someone who was in the administration building without proper authorization. She claims to be military personnel, but she's in civilian clothes and I couldn't verify her status. Coleman turned around, and, for a moment, her expression showed nothing but professional attention. Then, as her eyes focused on Sarah's face, her expression changed dramatically. The color drained from her cheeks, and she seemed to freeze in place. Sarah looked at Coleman with a slight smile that held just a hint of irony. Good morning, Master Sergeant Coleman, she said calmly. It seems there's been a bit of confusion this morning. Coleman's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Colonel Martinez, she said, the words carrying a weight that seemed to fill the entire room. There's been a mistake. Reynolds felt as though the floor had suddenly shifted beneath his feet. The woman he had just escorted to the security office as a potential unauthorized person was not only military personnel, but a full colonel. And not just any colonel, but the base commander herself. Sarah maintained her composure, but, inside, she was calculating the ramifications of this incident. Word would spread quickly through the base, and she would need to address the situation carefully to maintain both security protocols and the morale of her personnel. Yes, she said simply. There has been a mistake. Now, I believe we need to discuss how to prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of morning traffic outside the building. Reynolds stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Coleman looked as though she wanted to disappear into the floor. And Sarah Martinez, the commanding officer of Peterson Air Force Base, stood in the security office of her own installation, wondering how a routine morning coffee run had turned into a situation that would require damage control and some very careful explanations. The morning was still young, but already it was shaping up to be one of the most unusual days in the recent history of Peterson Air Force Base. And none of them had any idea that the real complications were just beginning. Master Sergeant Coleman's face had gone from pale to bright red in the span of 10 seconds. She snapped to attention so quickly that Reynolds heard her spine pop. "Colonel Martinez, ma'am, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding." Sergeant Reynolds is new to the base and, obviously, wasn't familiar with. Sarah held up a hand to stop the flood of explanations. "Master Sergeant, please have a seat. Both of you." Her voice was calm, but there was an undertone that made it clear this was not a request. "We need to discuss what happened here and how to prevent it from happening again." Reynolds remained standing, still processing the enormity of his mistake. He had just treated his commanding officer like a potential security threat. In his 15 years of military service, he had never experienced anything close to this level of embarrassment and professional mortification. "Sergeant Reynolds," Sarah said, turning her attention to the young MP first, "I want you to understand that you followed proper security protocols. When you see someone you don't recognize in a sensitive area, it's absolutely correct to verify their authorization. The problem wasn't your caution, it was the execution." She moved to the window and looked out at the base that had been her responsibility for the past 18 months. "However, there are several things we need to address. The first is the personnel roster system. Master Sergeant Coleman, has Sergeant Reynolds been trained on accessing the daily personnel updates?" Coleman shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Ma'am, we've been so focused on getting him oriented with the physical security procedures that we haven't completed all the administrative training yet. I plan to cover the personnel systems this week." Sarah nodded, making a mental note. This was exactly the kind of oversight that could lead to bigger problems down the line. That needs to be prioritized immediately. No security personnel should be working independently until they have full access to and training on all identification systems. She turned back to Reynolds, who was now standing at rigid attention. "Sergeant, at what point did you consider calling for backup or consulting your supervisor before deciding to escort me to the security office?" The question hit Reynolds like a physical blow. He realized that in his determination to handle the situation himself, he had skipped several steps that might have prevented the entire incident. "Ma'am, I wanted to be thorough, but I should have called Master Sergeant Coleman immediately when there was any question about authorization." "Exactly," Sarah said. "Security is never about one person making unilateral decisions. It's about systems and procedures that involve multiple checkpoints and verifications. What you did took courage, but it also showed a lack of understanding about how these systems should work." Before anyone could respond, the security office door opened and Captain David Park entered, carrying a stack of reports. He stopped mid-stride when he saw Colonel Martinez in the security office, flanked by two very uncomfortable-looking NCOs. "Colonel Martinez," he said, clearly surprised. "I wasn't expecting, is everything all right?" Sarah turned to face the captain, who served as the base security officer and was technically responsible for all the personnel in the room. "Captain Park, I'm glad you're here. We've had an interesting morning that I think provides a good learning opportunity for the entire security team." Park's expression shifted from surprise to concern as he quickly read the body language of everyone in the room. Coleman looked mortified, Reynolds appeared to be contemplating a career change, and the colonel had the calm demeanor that experienced military personnel recognized as the calm before the storm. Sarah proceeded to explain the morning's events in clear, measured tones. She outlined Reynolds' actions, the procedural gaps that had contributed to the situation, and the systemic issues that needed to be addressed. Park listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "Sir," Park said when she finished, "this is completely unacceptable. I take full responsibility for the inadequate training and will ensure the disciplinary action." "Captain," Sarah interrupted, before you start talking about discipline, let me ask you a question. In the past month, how many times have personnel challenged someone they didn't recognize in sensitive areas of the base? Park considered the question carefully. Honestly, ma'am, not as often as they should. Most people tend to assume that if someone is inside the secure perimeter, they belong here. Exactly. So while this morning's incident was embarrassing and could have been handled better, it actually demonstrates that Sergeant Reynolds was paying attention and taking his job seriously. The problem is that we haven't given our security personnel the tools and training they need to do that job effectively. She walked over to the wall map that showed the layout of Peterson Air Force Base. Here's what's going to happen. First, all security personnel will receive immediate refresher training on personnel identification systems. Second, we're implementing a buddy system for all challenges involving personnel recognition. No one acts alone. Third, we're creating a quick reference guide with photos and basic information about key base personnel that all security staff will carry. Reynolds finally found his voice. Ma'am, I want to apologize for. Sarah cut him off with a gesture. Sergeant, you don't need to apologize for doing your job. You need to learn from this experience and help us make sure the next person in your position has better tools to work with. Captain Park was taking notes as fast as he could write. Colonel, what about notification procedures? Should security personnel be required to contact their supervisors before taking action in situations like this? Good question, Sarah replied. The answer depends on the perceived threat level. If someone appears to be an immediate security risk, you act first and call for backup while you're acting. But, in a situation like this morning, where someone is cooperative and there's no immediate danger, the first step should always be to consult with supervision or access the personnel verification systems. Master Sergeant Coleman raised her hand tentatively. Ma'am, what about the fact that you were in civilian clothes? Should that have been a factor in Sergeant Reynolds' decision-making? Sarah smiled slightly, the first hint of humor she had shown since the incident began. Master Sergeant, that's actually the most important question anyone has asked this morning. Military personnel wear civilian clothes on base for dozens of legitimate reasons: medical appointments, special duties, personal time, official functions. The uniform is not the identifier, the proper credentials are. She moved back to the center of the room, where she could make eye contact with all three security personnel. But there's a bigger issue here that we need to address. This incident didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because we have new personnel who aren't fully integrated into our systems, established personnel who haven't kept up with all their training requirements, and procedures that aren't as clear as they should be. Captain Park looked up from his notes. Ma'am, are you saying that this incident represents broader problems with our security operations? I'm saying that this incident is an opportunity to examine our security operations and make sure they're as effective as they need to be, Sarah replied. Every mistake is a chance to improve, but only if we're honest about what went wrong and why. She checked her watch and realized that her medical appointment was now less than an hour away. Here's what's going to happen immediately. Captain Park, I want a complete review of our security training programs on my desk by the end of the week. Master Sergeant Coleman, you'll work with Sergeant Reynolds to identify every gap in his orientation and create a plan to address them within the next 2 weeks. Sergeant Reynolds, you'll assist in developing new procedures to ensure that future personnel in your position have better resources. Reynolds finally relaxed slightly from his rigid attention stance. Yes, ma'am. And, ma'am? Thank you for handling this the way you did. Sarah studied the young sergeant for a moment. She could see that he was genuinely committed to doing his job well and that this morning's embarrassment had been a hard lesson. Sergeant, in 20 years of military service, I've learned that the people who care enough to make mistakes while trying to do the right thing are usually the people you want on your team. Learn from this, help us fix the systems that contributed to it, and keep taking your responsibilities seriously. As she prepared to leave for her appointment, Sarah's radio crackled to life. Her aide, Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, was calling with an urgent message. Colonel Martinez, we have a situation developing in Building 400. There's been some kind of incident involving base personnel and security. Can you respond immediately? Sarah looked at the 3 security personnel in the room and felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. Lieutenant Walsh, what kind of incident? Ma'am, I'm getting conflicting reports, but it appears that someone has challenged the authority of base security personnel, and the situation is escalating. There are multiple people involved, and someone has called for backup. Captain Park was already moving toward his radio equipment. Colonel, I can respond immediately and... Sarah held up her hand to stop him. Negative, Captain. I have a feeling this situation might be more complicated than it appears. She keyed her radio again. Lieutenant Walsh, I'm en route to Building 400. Have all personnel maintain their current positions until I arrive. As they left the security office together, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the morning's coffee incident was about to become much more complicated. And she was beginning to suspect that the ripple effects of what had happened in the administration building were spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. The day that had started with a simple misunderstanding was evolving into something that would test not just the security procedures of Peterson Air Force Base, but the leadership skills of everyone involved. And Colonel Sarah Martinez was about to discover that sometimes, trying to quietly resolve one problem only creates bigger problems that demand much more public solutions. Building 400 housed the base communications center, and, as Colonel Martinez approached with Captain Park and the security team, she could see a crowd had gathered outside. 2 security vehicles were parked at angles that suggested their drivers had arrived in a hurry, and she could hear raised voices coming from inside the building. Lieutenant Walsh met them at the entrance, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. Ma'am, the situation started about 20 minutes ago. Apparently, word spread about the incident in the administration building, but the details got confused in transmission. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What kind of confusion, Lieutenant? Well, ma'am, some people heard that you had been detained by security, and others heard that there was an unauthorized person impersonating a colonel. Technical Sergeant Williams in communications heard a third version that suggested there might be a security breach involving someone trying to access classified systems. They entered the building to find Technical Sergeant Marcus Williams, a 12-year veteran with an exemplary record, in a heated discussion with Staff Sergeant Reynolds from earlier that morning. Reynolds had apparently been called to Building 400 as backup when Williams reported what he believed to be a security incident. I'm telling you, Sergeant, Williams was saying, his voice tight with frustration, I know what I heard. Someone was detained this morning for trying to access restricted areas, and now we have people walking around claiming to be base commanders. Something is seriously wrong here. Reynolds, who was still processing his own morning experience, was trying to explain that there had been a misunderstanding, but his explanations were only making Williams more suspicious. How do I know you're not part of whatever is going on? Williams demanded. You're the one who supposedly made the arrest in the first place. Sarah stepped into the communications center, and the room immediately fell silent. Williams turned to face her, and she could see the exact moment when recognition dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by the same expression of mortification that had become familiar to her over the past hour. Technical Sergeant Williams, she said calmly, I believe you wanted to speak with the base commander about a security concern? Williams's face went through several color changes before settling on a shade of red that matched his hair. Colonel Martinez, ma'am, there were reports. I thought. You thought you were protecting the base from a security threat, Sarah finished for him. Just like Sergeant Reynolds thought he was doing this morning. The question is, how did a simple case of mistaken identity turn into reports of impersonation, security breaches, and unauthorized access to classified systems? Lieutenant Walsh stepped forward with her notebook. Ma'am, I've been tracking the information flow. The original incident was reported correctly to the morning shift supervisors, but, when it was passed through informal channels, the details changed with each telling. Sarah nodded, recognizing a classic example of how quickly information could become distorted in a closed environment like a military base. What specific information did you receive, Technical Sergeant Williams? Williams consulted his own notes, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Ma'am, I was told that someone had been detained for attempting to access the administration building without authorization, that this person claimed to be a colonel, and that security was investigating possible identity theft or impersonation of base personnel. And, based on that information, what actions did you take? I initiated lockdown procedures for all communication systems pending security clearance, and I called for additional security personnel to conduct a sweep of sensitive areas, Williams replied. Standard protocol for suspected security breaches involving potential compromise of personnel identification. Sarah turned to Captain Park. Captain, how many people are currently involved in responding to this suspected security breach? Park was already on his radio, checking with base operations. After a brief conversation, he turned back to Sarah with an expression that suggested the situation was even more complicated than they had realized. Ma'am, we currently have 12 security personnel deployed across the base investigating reports related to this incident. Building 200 is in partial lockdown, the communications center has restricted all but essential traffic, and the base operations center has been notified that we may have a potential security situation. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, calculating the ripple effects of what had started as a simple case of mistaken identity. Lieutenant Walsh, get me a conference line with all department heads. We need to address this situation immediately before it gets any more out of hand. Within 10 minutes, Sarah was standing in the base conference room with her senior staff, the security personnel involved in both incidents, and several department heads who had been pulled away from their morning schedules to deal with what they believed might be a serious security crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah began, we are gathered here today because of a perfect storm of communication failures, procedural gaps, and well-intentioned people trying to do their jobs without having all the information they needed. She proceeded to walk through the entire sequence of events, starting with her decision to get coffee in civilian clothes, through the initial encounter with Sergeant Reynolds, the subsequent confusion in the security office, and the way that information had been distorted as it spread through unofficial channels. The bottom line, she continued, is that we have multiple security personnel and support staff who acted correctly based on the information they had, but the systems we have in place for handling and communicating information about security incidents are clearly inadequate. Major Patricia Sanchez, the base operations officer, raised her hand. Colonel, are you saying that our entire response this morning was based on a misunderstanding about your identity? I'm saying that our entire response this morning was based on a series of misunderstandings that were created and amplified by gaps in our procedures, Sarah replied. And, while today's situation was ultimately harmless, the same communication and procedural failures could create serious problems in a real emergency. She turned to face the assembled group. So we're going to use this as a learning opportunity. Captain Park will conduct a complete review of our security procedures and training programs. Major Sanchez will work with communications to develop better protocols for information verification and dissemination. And every person in this room will participate in developing new procedures to ensure that well-intentioned actions don't create unnecessary chaos. Technical Sergeant Williams raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am, what about the security measures I initiated? Should I begin standing down the communications restrictions? Sarah smiled at him. Technical Sergeant, your response was exactly what it should have been based on the information you received. But, this gives us a perfect opportunity to test our procedures for standing down from security alerts. Work with Captain Park to document every step of the process so we can identify any gaps there as well. Over the next hour, the group systematically worked through each aspect of the morning's events, identifying decision points where different information or procedures might have changed the outcome. Sarah was impressed with how quickly her staff adapted from initial embarrassment to productive problem-solving. Sergeant Reynolds, who had been silent through most of the discussion, finally spoke up. Ma'am, I keep thinking about what would have happened if there really had been a security threat. Would I have recognized it? Would I have responded appropriately? Sarah considered his question carefully. Sergeant, that's exactly the right question to ask. Today's events suggest that our current training and procedures need improvement, but they also showed that our personnel are alert and willing to take action when they perceive a threat. The goal is to make sure that when you do take action, you have the best possible information and support. As the meeting wound down, Sarah realized that her medical appointment was now completely out of the question. She would need to reschedule, which meant explaining to her doctor why the commanding officer of a major military installation had been unavailable because she had accidentally triggered a base-wide security response by trying to get coffee. Lieutenant Walsh approached as the room was clearing. "Ma'am, how would you like me to handle the official reports of today's incidents?" Sarah thought for a moment. "Document everything exactly as it happened, and include a detailed analysis of the procedural improvements that resulted from the situation. Sometimes the best lessons come from the days when everything goes wrong." 3 weeks later, Peterson Air Force Base completed the implementation of new security and communication procedures that had been developed as a direct result of what became known as the coffee incident. The new training program was so effective that it was eventually adopted by other installations across the Air Force. Sergeant Reynolds became one of the most effective security trainers in the command, using his experience to help new personnel understand the importance of following procedures while maintaining good judgment. Technical Sergeant Williams developed a new communication protocol that significantly reduced the spread of misinformation during security incidents. And Colonel Sarah Martinez learned to carry her military ID in a more visible location when wearing civilian clothes, though she never stopped appreciating the fact that her personnel cared enough about security to challenge someone they didn't recognize, even when that someone turned out to be their commanding officer. The incident also became a favorite story among base personnel, though the details were usually exaggerated in the telling. Some versions had Sarah being handcuffed, others had her thrown in the base jail, and a few particularly creative accounts suggested that she had been mistaken for a foreign spy. Sarah didn't mind the stories. In fact, she encouraged them. Because every time someone told the story of the day they tried to remove the base commander from her own base, it reinforced the importance of security procedures and the value of personnel who took their responsibilities seriously. And, in a world where military installations faced real security threats every day, having people who were willing to risk embarrassment to protect their base was exactly the kind of problem a commanding officer wanted to have. The morning that had started with a simple desire for coffee had ended up strengthening the security posture of the entire installation, improving communication procedures across multiple departments, and creating a training program that would benefit Air Force personnel for years to come. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, the most valuable lessons came from the days when absolutely everything went wrong in exactly the right way.